Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to start talking a little bit about um, finance and financial structure and what it can mean to an organization. And I think way back towards the beginning, I told you that towards the beginning of the class, I told you that finance is really just the structure and not necessarily affect operations at all. How I choose to structure my business financially can have a large effect on a variety of things, including the stockholders' returns, including various risk functions. Um, so how I structure myself really has a lot to do with how well I do as a business and how successful I am. So we're going to be talking about finance here. And there's some simple components, and you guys have done this long enough now with me that to know what all these components are. So really, the components are the balance sheet. So we have short-term assets, current assets. We have long-term assets. We have short-term or current liabilities, and we have long-term liabilities. So current assets are those things that I own that have value that will turn into cash within a year. Long-term assets are those things I own that will not turn into cash within a year. They're going to last longer than that. And liabilities is the same thing. Current liabilities are things I'm going to have to pay within a year. And long-term liabilities are things that I owe but are going to be due further away than 1 year. And then equity is the difference between assets minus liabilities equals equity, and that's the owner's share of the assets. So if I take everything I own, minus everything I owe, what's left is the stockholder's equity. So think about those components. You know about them all now. We've certainly done enough of this that you should be able to understand those and know what they are. And then there are some measurements. And once again, you've already seen some of these things. So when you did your common sizing problem, you looked at liquidity. And liquidity is the ability to fund short-term obligations. There's your fancy definition. Can I pay the people I owe when it's due? And the way we measure that, or one way we measure that, is current assets over current liabilities. It's called the current ratio. And the larger the ratio is, the more liquid we are, the more cash or near cash we have relative to the things that we're going to have to pay in the relatively near future. So liquidity is one measure, and then solvency is the other. And the primary measurement for solvency, once again, you've already seen this, is all of my debt, everything I owe, divided by all of my equity. And this generally talks about or computes or is used to measure the solvency of an organization, which is its long-term survivability. The larger the ratio, the more risk there is. So if I have a lot more debt than equity, I'm in a higher risk position than if I have a smaller amount of debt relative to equity. So that's 2. And then the third primary ratio we're going to look at here is return on equity. So how much does the company earn based on what their stockholders have invested, so the amount of equity invested. So how efficient are they at using their stockholders' equity? And this ratio will yield a percentage, a number less than 1, generally. I guess not always, but generally. And the higher the percentage is, the better the return for the shareholders. And essentially, there's a trade-off between return on equity and liquidity and solvency. So if I'm willing to risk to have be less solvent or less liquid, I may be able to improve my return on equity. So that's kind of the ratios we're going to look at, and we're going to look at how we can play with those ratios within an organization to change results. So a couple of things you should know. Long-term debt is generally more expensive than short-term debt because long-term debt carries a higher risk for the lender. So whoever lent you the money is going to want a higher return for long-term rather than short-term. So if you look at U.S. government debt, currently 30-year debt is at just under 3%. 10-year debt, 10-year notes are just over 2%, and 2-year notes are around 1.5%, something like that. So as you go longer, the interest rate goes higher because there's a higher risk associated with lending money longer term. And then risk is higher if we have a low liquidity ratio, and risk is higher if we have a high solvency ratio. So some things to think about there. And the financial goal always is to find the mean where risk and return are balanced. I want the highest return I can get within my tolerance for risk. So there's no right answer what the financial goal should be, but there's a golden mean for every company or every investor. Higher risk generally equals higher return, and where is my risk tolerance stop and how risky do I want to be to return or to get a higher return. So that's kind of the financial goal. And we're going to go through a very simple model and pay close attention because your homework or your assignment is going to be to do something like this for me. I'm going to give you some information and ask you to prepare a model and recommend a capital structure for a company. So here's some pieces about the model. In this particular model we're going to look at here, the percentages won't be the same on the one you get, but get the idea anyway. First of all, profit from operations in this model, all the profit from operations is constant. So how much money we earn doing whatever it is that we do is going to stay the same. These financial changes are not going to affect my operations. And that's fairly standard. Operations are about doing stuff. Finance is about where the money comes from and who gets the returns, I guess. And in this model that I'm going to show you, long-term debt costs 7% annually. Short-term debt costs 5% annually. And in order to compute our ratios, we're going to assume that average equity is the same as ending equity. So we don't have to take the beginning equity plus the ending equity and divide by 2. We're going to assume that ending equity is average equity. Makes the calculations a little easier and makes describing the model a little easier. So that's kind of my model constraints. So here's the base scenario. This is a company that has $50,000 in current assets, $150,000 in long-term assets, or total assets of $200,000. It has $70,000 in liabilities, current liabilities. It has $60,000 in long-term liabilities, total of $130,000, and it has $70,000 in equity. So the total liabilities and equity are $200,000, total assets are $200,000, balance sheet balances. And going over to the right there, my profit, my operating profit before interest costs is $15,000. My interest in this model is I'm paying 5% on my short-term money, which is $70,000, so that's $3,500 annually. And I'm paying 7% on my long-term money, which is $4,200 annually. And that gives me a net profit of $7,300. And if I go down below here, I've computed the ratios. Our current ratio with this scenario is 50 divided by 70, which is 0.71. So we have a less than 1 as our current ratio. We have slightly more current liabilities than current assets. Our debt to equity ratio is total debt 130, total equity 70, so 1.86. So we have $130,000 of debt and $70,000 of equity, so a little more debt than equity. And my return on equity, $70,000, $7,300 of profit is 10.43%. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, what can we do? We can do lots of things with this base scenario. We can increase our borrowing short term or increase our borrowing long term. We can sell more equity. We can sell stock to raise funds and pay off debt. And what I'm going to tell you to do is, if you're going to change one part of the balance sheet, you have to change the other part of the balance sheet. So if I'm going to raise more equity, I'm going to use that equity to pay off debt. If I'm going to borrow more money short term, I'm going to use that to either buy back equity or reduce long-term debt. So I can play around with these numbers, and this is actually pretty accurate. Most companies have the ability to do this. We can borrow short term, we can borrow long term, we can borrow and buy back our stock. And you've seen some of these things when you did your common sizing exercises. So we've got the standard numbers on the left, and what I've done here, I'm going to increase my long-term debt and reduce my short-term debt. Okay, that's a reasonable thing. So I'm going to borrow a little bit more money long-term, and I'm going to use that money I borrowed to pay off my short-term borrowing. When I do that, I'm going to improve my liquidity. Look at what happens to my current ratio. It goes from 0.7 to 1.67. So I go from a sort of a marginal liquidity situation to a very liquid situation. Remember, 1 sort of means liquid. So here I'm very liquid, and here I was not so liquid. So I've just done that. That's all I did. So I borrowed some money long term and I borrowed $40,000 long term and used it to pay my current liabilities short term. Sounds good. Okay, what does that do to my profit and and then what does it do to my ratios? So my profit from operations stays the same because that's part of my model. My short-term money costs less, so my short-term borrowing goes down, and now I have 30,000 times 5% or $1,500 in short-term interest, but my long-term borrowing goes up. So I have an additional 40,000. I have 100,000 at 7% or 7,000. So my profit goes from 7,300 down to 6,500. So my profit falls 11%. That's a pretty significant drop in profit because I've reduced my risk, but my profit is going to be a little less. My current ratio, I'm much more liquid. My debt to equity ratio doesn't change at all because all I did was swap one kind of a debt for another kind of a debt. And my return on equity, which may be one of the more important ratios here, my stockholders were making 10.4% on their equity investment. Now they're making 9.2%. So the company is less risky, but it's less profitable, and it's less profitable for the owners relative to their equity. Okay, makes sense. I'm lower risk, right? Okay, second one, we're going to increase short-term debt and reduce long-term debt. So we're going to flip it the other way. So this is going to reduce my liquidity, but it's going to improve both my profitability and my return on equity. So look at what happens. I take $50,000, I borrow $50,000 short term and use that money to pay off long-term debt. So now my long-term debt is only 10, but my short-term is 120. I now have a current ratio that falls to 0.42, which is getting pretty dicey. That's a very risky situation with short-term debt. I have to pay this 120 back, and I only have 50,000 in current liabilities. Might be okay depending on the business I'm in, forecasting future cash flows, but at least on the surface it looks relatively risky. Debt to equity doesn't change at all. I still have the same amount of debt. And my return on equity actually goes up. So instead of making 10.43, I make 11.86 because my income goes up. My income goes up because short-term debt is cheaper than long-term debt. So my short-term interest goes up 6,000. my long-term interest goes down almost to zero from $4,200 to $700, and my profit goes up 1,000 to 8,300. So 13, almost 14% higher profit because I'm using short-term money instead of long-term money. Pretty good. Understand what happened. Look at what happens to your ratios when all I'm doing is swapping some short-term money for long-term money. Not a big change, but it makes a pretty significant change in financial results as well as in risk. Okay, now I'm going to increase my long-term debt and reduce equity. So I'm going to borrow money long-term, and I'm going to use the money I borrow to buy back my stock. One of the companies that you looked at, Kirby, did this when you were doing your common sizing. They borrowed money long-term and used the proceeds, or some of the proceeds, to buy back their own stock. That's a big change because now we're changing two parts of the return on equity. So what did we do? We borrowed $40,000 long-term and we bought back stock. Okay, what does that do? It doesn't change my current ratio at all. It changes my debt to equity ratio massively because not only debt to equity is total debt, went from 130 to 170, over total equity, which went from 70 to 30. So one of them went down a lot and one of them went up a significant amount. So my debt to equity ratio goes from 1.8 to 5.6. So I go from a relatively low leverage position to a very high leverage position. And look at what happens to my return on equity. Wow, how did that happen? Well, look at this. Profit was 15,000. My profit actually goes down because my interest costs go up because I'm borrowing more, right? So my short-term interest costs are 3,500. They stay the same, but my long-term interest costs go up. So my profit goes down pretty dramatically, down 38%. But my stockholders are cheering because my return on equity went from 10.5% to 15%. It's a 50% increase in return on equity. The stockholders are rocking and rolling. They're really happy, but they're happy because I've taken on a lot more risk. My debt to equity ratio, my solvency ratio has increased dramatically. So stockholders are happy. Return on equity is good. Even though my income went down, the dollars per share went up. The debt to equity ratio improved. My earnings per share went up. And I'm in a good position from my stockholder standpoint as long as they don't look too closely at the risk I'm taking. So that's a change. And then number 4 option here, increase short-term debt and reduce equity. So I'm going to take on short-term debt and I'm going to buy back stock. Ooh, this looks like a high-risk strategy to me. So I'm going to reduce liquidity. I'm going to increase my debt to equity ratio. And I'm going to improve my return for stockholders big time. So same thing I did before, but this time I'm using short-term money, which is cheaper. So my interest costs aren't as high. My earnings go down 27%, but my return on equity goes to almost 18%, 17.6. So I haven't done anything. Nothing's changed here. All I've done is manipulate the balance sheet. What kind of money did I borrow? Where did I get my money? I'm changing where I get my money. Where are my resources? And I've changed it around to different scenarios. So I gave you 4 scenarios. You could have 24 scenarios if you wanted. I've taken kind of random numbers, but any of these are possible. And so the real question becomes, if you're the CFO, what do you want to do? Which one do you choose? What's your recommendation for the capital structure of this company? It's hard to know. I can go from, I think the first one was a 9% return on equity to an almost 18% return on equity, twice the return. But I go from a really low risk, low leverage situation to a really high risk, high leverage situation in the meantime. So you can see the results, you can see the changes as I change my capital structure. And companies do this all the time. And it doesn't affect operations generally. If you're working in the company, you may not even see the change. But it changes the returns, makes the company more or less attractive to investors, increases the risk. And obviously, when you increase risk, your risk of failure is greater, but the rewards are greater if you don't fail. So um, I think this gives you a pretty good analysis of what the financial options are. Obviously, a very simple model. I'm going to ask you to do for homework or for an assignment a similar thing. I'm going to give you a problem with some information. I'm going to ask you to set up spreadsheets that look like this. They don't have to look exactly like this, but look like this in terms of how they're presented, and to look at a bunch of what ifs. If I do this, if I do that, and then make a recommendation to the board of directors of your company as to what you recommend that they do. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. I can make an argument for this scenario very easily, and I can also make an argument for this scenario. So what scenario do you think works in the example that I'm giving you? So you have to set this up, make it presentable, as in well formatted, so that you could go to the board and explain the options, and then have a written explanation in your Excel file of what you recommend that the board of directors do. So that's your assignment. That's going to be due at the end of the week, and then we will go into our last lectures next week, which will talk a little bit about cost accounting, and then your final quest will be due also at the end of next week. So we're winding up here. Very good. I will talk to you all later. Thanks.